The question that we want to start with, and this is a big question that bothered me in all of my life as a manager, as an executive, as a CEO, as a management consultant, is why do we have a situation in most organizations where managers go home at the end of the day feeling badly about what they didn't get done instead of feeling good about what they did get done? And it's systemic in organizations. So if we think about what is happening in organizations, there are situations in organizations that are detracting from managers being able to be effective in their work. And organizations are aware of this, and they are trying to do things about it, but they're not being very successful because we've all been in the workforce for a while, and this has existed for a while, and it's continuing to exist in organizations. The other thing that we find that often happens in organizations is that we have situations where managers, in spite of all of the necessary work that they have to do, are in conflict situations. So when I think about the situation of managers, and I've talked to thousands of managers in my day as a management consultant, and something that the common thread across managers are that, number one, they feel they have more work to get done than they're able to get done. So there's more is delegated to them than they can do. The second thing that happens is that they feel that they don't have the resources that they need to do the work. And then the third thing that happens is that they don't feel that they have the understanding to be able to set the priorities that they need for their work. So they don't have the context to be able to make those priority decisions for doing work. And then if you throw into that mix the kind of conflict situations that they have in organizations, then we see very quickly that managers get stuck in the middle in terms of how do I focus in, use my best intentions and make good decisions in order to be able to get the work done that needs to be done. And this really does matter in organizations. There are many research studies out there that reinforce the importance of the managerial workforce in organizations. This study here by Lee Braum, the 7 hidden reasons employees leave, say that 70% of employees leave for factors that are directly controllable by their managers. This other research by Gallup, and I just love the Gallup research because it gives you so much insight into all of this research that they've been doing over the past decades. They're really starting to mine this now. But they say that work groups that are ineffectively managed are 50% less productive and 44% less profitable. So organizations should be paying attention to this work. The other research I want to point out to you, and I know many of you in the room are HR people, so and even those of us that aren't in HR necessarily have seen this service profit chain. It was first published back in 1994 by Heskett. He's a professor at Harvard University, and he published this in Harvard Business Review, and it was quite a sensation at the time because he made the case that employee satisfaction leads to customer satisfaction, leads to increased profit in organizations. In not-for-profit organizations, you might think about increased service, or in government, you might think about increased service, but nonetheless, it held that if your employees are more satisfied, then customer satisfaction goes up, and as a result of that, their lifetime value of the customer increases over time. What we forget nowadays, because it's been, 94, so over 20 years since this was published, and there's been a lot of reaffirming research, is that this entire service profit chain is driven by managerial leadership. And Heskett makes this point very clearly in his original paper, but somehow we've forgotten about that. Employee satisfaction is driven by the way in which individuals in the organization are managed. So we can't lose sight of that. So we wanted to understand more about this because there was in my searching of that original question that I put up there for you, we really started trying to do as much reading as we could to understand what was driving this, and found that there was literally no published research that looked at the effectiveness of managers. And there was very little research that looked at accountability in organizations. And I thought we had some relationship there that we needed to work through. So we partnered with the University of Ottawa, and we developed a research-based study which could work with real live organizations and actually ask managers how effective they are and find out from them what some of the key factors are that we would have in the organization. So the first goal was very simple. It's just to ask managers how effective they are, and we did that in a couple of ways, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And the second thing we did was to try to understand what some of the factors in organizations are that drive this effectiveness of managers in organizations. So the findings were actually quite startling. So managers self-reported that they spend only 55% of their time on value-added work. So think about that, 55%. That's like the CEO saying to all the managers in your organization, you can show up for work around morning coffee time on Wednesday and work for the rest of the week, because the rest of it's not going to be very impactful anyway. If CEOs of organization and the heads of HR supporting them could recover just 10% of that and increase 10% of productivity, for an organization with 100 managers, it would be like having 10 additional managers working for you and focused in 100% on the work that needs to be done. So the payoffs can be huge to organizations in terms of understanding this. So what we do know from this then is that managers are just not able to focus in on their value-added work. And value-added work, now this is kind of, take note of this. What is value-added work? Value-added work is work that an individual with their capability in their position is able to do. So value-added work is very different for every individual, but it's only work that individuals in their position with their capability are able to do. As a side note, I think I'd like to take a little bit of a tangent here in terms of value-added work. There's three different categories of value-added work. The first one is what I call the position description work. So you've got a position description, you come in the morning, you know what your job is, nobody has to tell you what to do, we're professionals, so we do that work. So it's that work and the continuous improvement of that work. The second part of value-added work is something that's been delegated to you specifically to do within a certain time frame, and that's usually strategic change work, task force work, project management work. So you're asked to do, or sitting maybe on a project team to accomplish some change in the organization. So that's quite bounded, and that usually gets fairly good attention. The third one, and this one often doesn't make the list, is the managerial leadership work. So I, as a manager, must also set time aside to manage my subordinates so that they can be aware of what they're being held accountable for and what their work is in the organization. So if we're so distracted in the workplace that we're only spending 55% of our time on value-added work, what's going to fall off of that list? We're not going to stop doing our day-to-day work with the continuous improvement. If we've been delegated to run a project team or to sit on a project team, we're going to be doing that work. What tends to fall to the bottom of the list every day is that managerial leadership, the coaching, the mentoring, the performance management, the feedback, the fair and timely feedback of employees in the organization. So it creates this situation where we started in the beginning, where there's a lack of focus in the managerial workforce simply because a lot of that managerial work that should be happening in organizations simply is not happening. And we asked managers what time have they spent, what percentage of the time are they spent doing stuff that they weren't hired to do. In other words, it has nothing to do with their job. And what percentage of their time was spent doing work that could be delegated to a qualified administrative assistant. So if you add that together, those are the kind of two major components of what value-added work is not. So, and when you add them together, you see that we end up with 46, so 54% of their time is spent on work that's not in either of these two categories. So it's a kind of way of reinforcing whether or not our data was accurate. So the drivers of effectiveness. I've hinted at this a couple of times in terms of what is the main driver of effectiveness. And what we found in the research with the University of Ottawa, this is the Telfer School of Management, is that those organizations which had higher accountability had higher effectiveness. And the correlation was startling, 0.74. So we did our tests using a 10-point Likert scale. So we asked 94 questions, and on one side, do you disagree strongly? The other side is, do you agree strongly? And everything in between. So the score was 7.4 out of 10, basically. So very strong correlation. A correlation of 0 means no correlation. A correlation of 1 means perfect correlation. So 0.74 is very high for managerial science type studies. So we know then that accountability is a major factor in organizations. And this gave me a bit of a pause because we're trying to figure out, You know, from my sense, most people in organizations feel pretty accountable for work in the organization, so we had to dig a little bit deeper on that. I'd like you to think about this question because I'm going to put you to work in a few minutes. So the question is, what can you do to improve manager effectiveness in your organization? So the starting point then, if accountability is so important in organizations, is to understand what is accountability. This was another big eye-opener for me. In the reading that I did, I looked specifically through all the managerial sciences literature for studies on accountability. And I found a mere handful of researchers that were writing in this area. And startlingly, each one of them defined accountability in a different way. So how can we get any kind of consistency in a profession such as management if we're even not using the word in the same way? Imagine chefs trying to share recipes across cookbooks, and nobody knows what a teaspoon is or a tablespoon is or a cup is. You just wouldn't be able to do it. Or an engineer trying to build a building without definitions of tensile strength and force and power and all of that stuff. I mean, it's just necessary that you have these definitions. So this is our starting point definition, and we're working as hard as we can to promote it. So it's an obligation for which one can be held to account for one's results and one's actions by a specified other. So three really important aspects to this. So the first one is being held to account. So it's this sense of being accountable for something. You're carrying the weight of having to produce something. The second aspect is the actions and the results both go hand in hand. So it's not accomplishing the ends in any way possible. It's accomplishing them appropriately. And then the third is this idea of a specified other. And this is where it really goes wrong in organizations, is that people don't understand this idea that to be accountable for something, you have to be accountable to someone. In an organization, that would be your manager, your boss, the person who is able to delegate to you. If one holds oneself accountable for something, that's a different thing. I call that responsibility. So when we go out here for coffee, we might see some litter on the floor, and we might bend over and pick that litter up and throw it away because we have a self-held belief that, you know, we want to keep the place neat and we want to be kind to others. So that's a responsibility. We feel a responsibility to do that. The accountable person is the janitorial crew that comes in the evening to clean this place up. So they're accountable to someone for keeping this place neat. Now, don't get me wrong, responsibility is important. We can't operate organizations without responsibility. I might want to help a colleague because I'm good at PowerPoint and they're not. So I'm not accountable to be the help desk for PowerPoint. But if in 5 minutes I can save somebody an hour of grief, that's a really good thing in an organization. So I don't want to say it's good or bad. I'm just saying they're different, and we have to understand the differences between them. So in an employment situation, what we've talked about does describe this manager-subordinate relationship. I use the subordinate word because that's really the best word to describe what that is. And I'm not talking about a person being subordinate to another person. I'm talking about a role in an organization being subordinate to another role. Many organizations prefer terms that are softer, like direct report or whatever. But the important thing is that we understand that you have a manager and you have someone to whom another individual is accountable for doing work. So remember I said that I was a bit surprised that accountability in and of itself was so highly correlated to the effectiveness of managers in organization. And this was the other really big aha moment. And the big aha moment is that there's actually two different dimensions to accountability. So the first dimension is felt accountability. How strongly do I feel accountable for doing something? The second is clarity of accountability. How clearly do I understand that for which I am accountable? And it's only by teasing apart these two things that we can come to understand why accountability in and of itself is so important for effectiveness in organizations. So people do feel accountable. They're saying that name me accountable. In felt accountability, they score very high. I kind of equate this to a term paper. If it was a term paper, they would be A. It's 8.7 out of 10. Yeah, 8.7 out of 10. So that's a very high score. People do feel accountable for doing things. But clarity of accountability scores at a B minus, flirting with a C. So it's 7.1. Almost 3 complete points between them two. So 2.6 points between the two. So while individuals do feel accountable for doing things, they're not clear about what it is that they should be accountable for. So when we go back to the very first introduction that I had for you, where managers feel that they're being pulled in so many different directions, it's no wonder if organizations do not have the systems in place where managers can be clear about those things that they're accountable for. How can they possibly make the best choices possible in terms of the work that they have to do? They're more likely to be allowing themselves to be pulled in many different directions because they can't make that weight and balance between, or make the shift and balance between those things that need to be done and those things that would nice to be done. So whether or not then in organizations we're clear with accountabilities, people will feel that they're accountable for something, and people will do work that they feel needs to be done. The question is whether they will be spending their time on the right work or not. Here's the other really interesting part, and I'll refer to this a bit. We don't have time today to get into this in a lot of detail, but clarity of action, this absolutely is driven by clarity of accountability. So from the CEO, doing the CEO's managerial work, through the VPs, to the directors, to the frontline managers, to the employees, if there's clarity, of that chain of clarity of accountability, then there will be clarity of action. So people will be able to make decisions in a consistent way throughout the organization. But it also leads to clarity of interaction, because if you have this clarity of action coming down the organization and all of the different channels that it can come down, from the CEO right down to the front line, and if I understand my work and I understand your work and how our two jobs relate to each other, it's much more likely to reduce the kind of conflict that we see in organizations all the time and enable us to collaborate in a way that's going to be more productive for the organization and more satisfying for us as individuals, because we will always be on each other's case about trying to get work and do work in the same way with each other. So the starting point, and this is a really important one, that as organizations get larger, they need more systems to continue to be as effective as they were when they were smaller. So small organizations, startup organizations, organizations that sort of have the workers, the front line, and then the head of the organization, can operate pretty much as a team. The CEO has the charisma, the idea, the passion, knows everybody by first name. They might even have coffee together once in a while. So there's a real sense of how we're collaborating as a team, who does what. It might not even be written down anywhere yet, but everybody understands what they have to do to be a success in the company. But as organizations get larger, then it's an unfortunate necessity that the head of the organization needs to have more and more systems in place to be able to ensure that the decisions that he or she takes for the direction of the company are appropriately delegated down the organization. So the only way you can do that is with an accountability and authority framework. So how do I ensure that when I make a decision based on the advice of my executive management team, that it is going to be implemented in a concerted and consistent way by each of the VPs, without all of the filters that they may bring to bear from their areas, and then in return delegate it to the next level down. I was at a conference in the Netherlands in the summer, and we were just delighted to have the ex-CEO of Shell in the room. Now, this is a huge multi-conglomerate company with operations around the world. And he had a 4-word mission for his organization, which was leaner upstream, stronger downstream. So basically what he wanted to do was be more efficient on the source and more effective and customer-oriented at the end. So people would ask him what his goal was, or what his mission was, or what his vision was, or what the values were, and he always gave the same 4-word answer for it, because he wanted to be just very, very consistent. And he talked about his -1s and his -2s. So he said part of his work was to ensure what the implications of this vision that he had, that it was going to be implemented come hell or high water, you could tell just by the way he was talking from the podium, that this was going to be implemented in a consistent way. And he says, and that the -1s would do their work with the -2s. So it's not enough that I delegate to you as my subordinate. I have to also ensure that you as my subordinate are delegating to your subordinates in a consistent way and translating this into language that they understand and chunking down the work into pieces that they can handle and that they will be capable of and will be their value-added work. The other thing he said that was really interesting is that he would go into the field, and he said if he'd ever find a place where somebody didn't understand how their work related back to what he had set at the executive management team, he says, then I would work my way down the channel and find out where it was broken. He says, I only had to do that twice. And after that, they got the message that everybody had to have this consistency going on. So the hard work of managing actually starts with the CEO. So many CEOs figure, I'm here, we work with the executive management team, they're senior people, they get it, they help develop the strategy. So once the strategy is approved by the board, then we have a little celebratory dinner and everybody gets on with their work and I can move on to the next thing. Actually, the hard work is really just starting for the CEO at that point. The second point on this bullet is that you also need then for the CEO to be able to have some way much more formal in terms of gathering information upwards. So certainly management by walking around is still really, really important, but there needs to be more formal ways of gathering information. So employee engagement surveys tend to be the most common way of doing that now, and there are other ways of gathering information in formal ways. But I wanted to give you a caution. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this one because employee engagement surveys can have some downside if you don't use them properly. And I want to say to you right up front that I'm not against employee engagement surveys because we do know it's a fact, it's proven in research so many times that organizations that score high on the factors in employee engagement surveys are higher performing organizations. So it's really important stuff to know about. But there's a bigger question, and I would like to talk to you about that for just a couple of minutes. So this is from Gallup. It's the state of the American workplace. They don't have an equivalent for Canada. I'm looking for it, but the numbers are pretty similar on a year-on-year basis. So they started this back in the year 2000, and they measure engaged employees. So those are the go-getters. They're going to do the work. They come in early. They are looking for extra work. They really want to get things done. They're kind of your A team. They're the ones that you delegate the project management work to because you know they're going to get the team together and they're going to do whatever it takes to get that work done. They've scored the engaged in the workforce are from 26%, 30%. In the last year that we have the data, 2012, it was 30%. So about a third of your workforce is what we would call engaged, the keeners, the really go-getters. The big orange one in the middle are not engaged. Those are kind of thought of as the walking dead. They come in, they do their work, they gather their paycheck, they do what they're told, they want to do well, but they do it within the work. So they're the kind that sort of on the front line, if they run out of work, the paperback will come out as opposed to going and looking for whatever that extra work would be. And the scary part is down here, like 2 in 10, 18, 16, 17, 15, up to 18% 2 years ago, are the actively disengaged. So they're actually working counter to the company. They've got such a mad-on for the company that they will sabotage or work against the mission of the organization. So they will actively try to avoid work or not support the work of the company. So here's the question for you. These factors are important. So we know that these factors are important. We've been measuring this stuff for 15 years now. And yet if you look at the trend line, I don't have access to the original data, so I can't do this scientifically, but with my research eyes on, the trend line looks kind of like that. So if this is important stuff and we're measuring it and organizations are being given these results, surely they're trying to do something to change this situation. And the situation reflected as in the first few slides today that I talked about in terms of managers just being distracted from their work. So if this was important stuff, you would expect that over the years the trend line would have come down like this. So I've got the answer for you. I'd like to give you one example of that, and I pick on the example of communication. pick communication because every employee engagement survey I've ever seen, communication, in other words, we don't communicate as well as we could, is usually number one or number two, usually number one, but if it's not number one, it's number two. And I think what's happening is the discussion around the water cooler goes something like this. So I'm talking to my good friend here at the water cooler, and we just waiting for the coffee to get brewed. And I say, you know, I was working on this project, and my boss delegated it to me 2 weeks ago, so I've been really working night and day. And I just found out that last week, executive management team canceled it, and I didn't find out until today. So I just wasted a whole week of my work. Boy, do we have poor communication around here. So it's the language used to describe this lack of information that I need to do my work well is thought of as communication in the organization. In fact, what happened is there is a break somewhere in the managerial delegation of work down the organization. So managerial delegation is more than just saying, do this by then. It's also setting context for the work. It's giving fair and timely feedback. And it's giving them right-sized information that you need to do your job at the right time in the right way. So the CEO can send out all the emails that he wants. In fact, what often happens when you see communication at the top of the list in an employee engagement survey is you create an internal communication department, or you do more newsletters, or you do more town halls because you're trying to communicate more. And that might have a little bit of an uptick. But in fact, the real cause is that managers aren't getting the right information that they need to do their work in the right time frame, and that's managerial delegation work. So what we're seeing in the employee engagement surveys aren't really the problems, they're the symptoms. So I liken it to giving an aspirin. So I go to the doctor and I've got a fever and the doctor gives me some aspirin, the fever goes away, I'm feeling pretty good about that. But what's going to happen? The fever will come back because we've only treated the symptom, we haven't treated the underlying disease. So what's really, really important in organizations is to get beneath the surface and understand what is the cause of some of these issues. The other one that we see on employee engagement surveys all the time is collaboration. We have poor collaboration. And the talk there at the water cooler tends to be, you know, I promised my boss this report tomorrow, but I needed some information from finance, so I asked them for the information. They said they would have it to me this morning, and you know what, it's not here. So I phoned them, and they said, well, sorry, something came up, I won't be able to get it to you until next week. So now I'm going to look like an idiot with my boss. Boy, do we have poor collaboration here. So again, now this is managerial delegation. There's a lack of common understanding of, in finance, how do we support the work of finance? It happens all the time in HR. I see it all the time in HR. You're given service provision accountabilities. You're not resourced to support the whole organization in the time frame you would like to do it. So you're always having to say no and juggle, and you know, somebody comes and they say, I want this posted tomorrow because it's really urgent, and you look at the lists that you have from all of your other clients, and you say, well, I can only have that for you, you know, next week. And they say, boy, do we have poor collaboration here, when in fact it's just the way the resourcing in the organization works. So what we need to do is really then put in place this accountability and authority framework for how work flows down the organization and how work flows across the organization. And what that is really changing the way discussions take place in the organization, so that the CEO is having the right discussions with the vice presidents. So the CEO is accountable for implementing the strategy, for example. So the CEO needs to say, this is my value-added work, this is what I'm going to do to ensure that 5 years from now we're going to be where we told the board we're going to be. Now for me to be successful in doing that, you, Mr. Vice President, you, Madam Vice President, you, Madam Vice President, need to be able to do this in your area, this in your area, this is in your area, this is how you collaborate across with each other, this is how you will support me in doing what I need to do, and by the way, this is what you need to do now in terms of breaking up those things you're accountable for and making sure that they move down your piece of the organization within context and in the right time frame. So what you need is a language for how work is delegated down the organization, and more importantly, you need common terms for what that accountability and authority is for how work flows across the organization. So here what we're doing is saying that in terms of of understanding how to change the organization, you have to understand what the state of the organization is. So, so what we've done is use the survey form that we developed with the University of Ottawa Telfer School to create a survey for CEOs and heads of HR where they can use that to assess the effectiveness of managers in the organization, see how they compare in their organization vis-a-vis benchmark, and also to give you some strategies about how you can really get to that root cause issues and implement training programs. We talked about training programs that can help managers understand how to do their work within a managerial framework that will make a difference. So I've got two different white papers that I'm going to offer to you. So the one I'm talking about now is the effective point of accountability. We've got the registered trademark for that. We were really excited to get that just a few months ago, where we do lay out what such a framework could look like.
Calian's participation in the survey, when Dwight and I were speaking to you today, we thought that perhaps understanding how a company used the research and how we applied it and what we learned from it would be helpful for all of you. So I started with Calian in July of 2013, and Dwight approached us in the fall of 2013 and asked us if we wanted to participate in the survey. We took a look at the premise behind it, what he was looking at. We knew that it was providing some research into a local university, and we were happy to support the research and help out with local universities, so we decided to participate. And it was about 2 years ago now that we took part, and happy to say that of the managers we asked to participate, we had 100% participation rate. And I have to say that our staff are actually incredibly good at participating in surveys. So any surveys that we have, we generally get very high participation rates. Knowing we were coming in with 100% of our managers providing feedback, we knew we had some solid data to work with, and we didn't need to extrapolate and think, well, they might mean this. We knew what they meant. We had their data. So a little bit about some of our results. We had a couple of areas of strength that we were very happy about. Overall manager effectiveness, and on the bottom, the manager capability. So we were very pleased to see that our managers felt overall that they were effective and capable, and that their manager was effective and capable. We had high results in clarity of accountability and high results in felt accountability. So if you recollect from Dwight's slides, he talked about clarity of accountability, or accountability in of itself, that you needed to be account to someone for something. And having both of those show up as strengths or high results, we started to step back to say, okay, do we really have, people are saying there's high clarity, but they're also high felt. So are people feeling accountable for things that people aren't actually holding them to account for, if you go back to that definition? So something we needed to think about. In terms of our areas of opportunity, role conflict came up as an issue that we needed to take a look at. And workflow, which I think kind of intertwine. And if you think about, again, what Dwight said, work flows not only down, but it flows across. And one of the areas we also had very high scores on was in the area of interdependence. So our managers were saying, I think we were about 94% in that our managers said, we rely heavily on others to get our jobs done. So with high interdependence, high role conflict, and potential workflow issues, that was something we needed to look at, because those three mixed together weren't necessarily giving us a good sign. And then rounding out the bottom, the corporate support system. So were our systems optimized to really drive manager effectiveness? And the results were certainly indicating that they were not optimized for that. So digging a little bit more into the concept of the clarity of accountability, our highest scoring question, I'm clear as to who I'm accountable for or accountable to at work, which I guess is a positive thing. However, some of the lower scoring questions we had. So I get mixed messages from people concerning what I'm accountable for. And my accountabilities at work conflict with my accountabilities in other areas. So was that potentially feeling around that felt accountability area where people were kind of seeing there was some conflict? Maybe they felt that they were accountable for things, and that was showing up and creating conflict because someone wasn't holding them accountable for that, and that wasn't the stuff they really should have been accountable for. There were a couple of other questions that were kind of in the same theme, which were, I need to do things for groups who operate very differently from one another, and certain things will be accepted by one group and the same thing will not be accepted by another group. So again, you think about that role conflict and workflow, there was definitely a lot of stuff pointing into some potential things we needed to look at there. And then flipping back over to the felt accountability, we saw some really positive things coming out here. I'll bring your attention to the second one about being accountable to reflect the proper values of the organization. We were really pleased to see that come up. And in fact, in other surveys that we've done, that typically rises to the top, that individuals feel very akin to the values we have as an organization and accountable to those values. So we felt very good about that. But speaking about what Dwight was saying, we really felt it was necessary that, again, that we look at that delegation of accountability and making sure that we were driving that delegation down appropriately and ensuring that what people were feeling accountable for is what they were actually accountable for according to the managers. So I want to bring us forward now to today. So there's been a couple of things that have occurred since we participated in this survey. One is that we've reorganized our internal structure, and a second is that we've launched a new performance management program, and I'll talk a little bit about those. So in terms of the restructuring, back when this survey was run, we had an operations team, we had a sales team, and then we had divisional services or shared services. And we have 3 distinct lines of business and some blurred lines about who was responsible for the different lines of business. And as those lines solidified even more, having a large operations team and a sales team, there were certain things that were getting missed, certain things that were being duplicated just by virtue of how we were organized. So we've since reorganized now, and we have 3 distinct service lines focused in the sector and the markets that they're responsible for, and then our divisional services team, so the back office, the IT, finance, HR. And by doing that, I believe we've reduced that role conflict because individuals are now very clear, I am supporting this service line, and in that service line we have the sales, we have the operation, we have the recruiting teams. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Calian, but people are our business, so I always call our recruiting team our manufacturing engine, and they're the ones producing the product, if you will. So they now sit distinctly in the service lines instead of that broad operational team, so they're very clear about what they're accountable for. And it's increased the focus, I believe, strongly in the organization as well. So I think if we were running the survey today, we would see different results because of the way we've now restructured our organization. And then the second thing that we've done, which will be near and dear to anyone who's in human resources in the room and to your hearts, is we've really changed our performance management program. So the program that was in place at the time we ran this survey was one that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, which is that backwards looking type of let's talk about what happened, and quite subjective, and had no opportunity for individuals to actually establish goals and what they were going to be doing. So very, very backwards looking. So we've now replaced that with what we're calling our performance development program, which is much more of an agile goal setting process where it starts at the beginning of the year, where we're identifying the priorities for an individual, and those priorities align with what the service line needs and what the service line needs aligns up into the larger organization. So we have that clearer line of sight. And individuals are much clearer in terms of, okay, what is it I need to do? Because it's now written right down on their PDP, their performance development program. And then we now have the more frequent conversations. Because as we all know, priorities shift and change. So the goals are not locked in day 1 and re-looked at day 365. They're constantly evolving and changing because priorities are shifting and changing. So we want to make sure that people are continually being refocused on the things they need to be focused on that we've identified as priorities in the business. So that's a real switch from what it was at the time when we ran the survey. And if you recollect back when I mentioned some of our areas of opportunity, the corporate support systems were one of them. And I think this shift has really changed that, and that we addressed one of our corporate support systems because it really was not effective at driving that accountability. So just to wrap up, some of the other areas of impact from the survey, as I mentioned, interdependence still is top of mind for me, because even with the reorganization, I still know that managers rely very heavily on other people to get their work done. And that drives the concept of collaboration that Dwight was closing off with as well, is that we want to ensure that we have the right systems in place to effectively drive collaboration, so we don't have people, quote, assigning work to one another, as opposed to actually working together and ensuring that things get done. So when we're establishing goals at the beginning of a PDP cycle, that they're not done in isolation, because most goals rely on other people to get parts done. If we need something done that relies on IT, if IT doesn't have that as a goal on their PDP, you've almost structured yourself for failure right at the beginning, because you don't have alignment and collaboration within the organization to be effective in getting your goals done. So I hope that provided at least a little bit of a snapshot of how an organization took some of the research that Dwight and the researchers at the University of Ottawa were working on, and how we applied it, how we think about it, and how we continue to think about it even a couple of years after we were part of the survey. And I'd like to turn things back over to Dwight now, who's going to close off for us.
So just to let you know, we do have a website, effectivemanagers.com. There's a lot of resources on there. There's blogs, we have guest articles, and it's full of downloads that you can also get from there. Also, we have a series of recorded webinars. I think there's about 37 webinars that are between 30 and 60 minutes in length, where we look into things like trust in organizations and the Peter Principle, and how to delegate, and why there is so much dysfunction in organizations. There's just a lot of different topics there. So if you're ever interested in taking a bit of a deeper dive, you can look at that. In addition, you can register for an e-newsletter, which is a monthly e-newsletter, to get sort of monthly thoughts in terms of managing and improving manager effectiveness. So do feel free to register there. Okay, thank you very much.